So what is this PFAS anyway? It's a group of man-made chemicals. These are not things that occur in nature. And the title PFAS is an acronym that's PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So they are essentially they're characterized by long chains of carbon atoms with fluorine attached to it. And then with different lengths of that chain and different functional groups on the end, that's what creates this huge class of more than 6,000 chemicals. These have been used for decades, probably since the 40s and 50s for sure, in commercial residential applications. So everything from nonstick cookware coatings, think Teflon, water repellent fabrics and furnitures and carpets, and Scotchgard is the name brand. They're used in a lot of paper packaging, particularly for food products. So if you go to a fast food restaurant and you buy a cheeseburger, your cheeseburger, that's what keeps the cheese from sticking to the paper. It's in the pizza delivery box when it comes to your house. If you fix microwave popcorn, that's what keeps the oil from soaking through the bag. Another common use for it is it's used in aqueous film-forming foams or firefighting foams. And so it's seen quite a bit around airports because it's really good at putting out really hot fires. The challenges with these compounds is that carbon-fluorine bond is incredibly difficult to break. It's one of the strongest chemical bonds known. And as a result, it's earned the nickname in the media of forever chemicals because these things just do not break down in the environment. And there is emerging evidence that indicates that these are health risks, possibly at quite a bit lower levels than what the EPA had originally established. So about these health advisories, first of all, they're not regulatory limits, they're advisory limits. But in 2015, EPA established a health advisory for two specific chemicals in this class, PFOA and PFOS. And the standard at that time was that the concentration of those two chemicals, if you add them together, that needs to be below 70 parts per trillion. So not million, not billion, but trillion. A challenge with that was up until about 18 months ago, we could not even test at that level. The detection limit for then state-of-the-art analytical methods was around 100 parts per trillion. About 18 months ago, that changed. There are new EPA methods that are now approved that allow us to test down to about 2 parts per trillion. So on June 15th, a couple of weeks ago, EPA, I think it's fair to say they stunned the drinking water community when they came out with new standards that specifically looking at PFOA are a factor of 12,500 times lower than what the previous health advisory was. So where it was before 70 parts per trillion, now it's 0.004 parts per trillion, or 4 parts per quadrillion. When I was first told what those numbers were going to be by an insider, I thought this person's an attorney, sorry Mark, but they must have just got the units wrong. That can't be right, but this is actually what they came out with. So for PFOA, PFOS, these are now considered interim health limits. EPA is still working on the science. For the other two, PFBS and HFPO, or sometimes those are referred to as the Gen X chemicals, both of those are considered final health advisory. So EPA believes that the science is settled on those two. So in comparing our results to those standards, the current limit of quantification, like I said, is 2 parts per trillion. That means that the detection limit is 500 times higher than what the health advisory is for PFOA. So that's a challenge right there. We cannot measure anywhere near what these new health advisory levels are. So when we compare our numbers, we have done 4 rounds of sampling since December. For the two newest standards, PFBS and HFPO, we are comfortably below what those new health advisories are. But for the other two, with the interim standards, we are above that. So again, the really confusing part about this and trying to explain it to folks is that EPA says these are advisory levels. These are not maximum contaminant levels, which is the regulatory limits that are set under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And they're even on their website with all of they actually put out a lot of material, but it repeatedly says over and over, if you have questions, ask your utility. And they've given utilities very little information to react to and to provide information to customers. So that aspect of this has been a little challenging to deal with. So like I said, we have been looking for these chemicals in our water since, we've been taking action since January. Our first samples were collected in December. There's more questions than answers right now. So as a staff, we felt that the first thing we could do to help our customers understand was to just be as transparent as we possibly could. And so we've made the commitment, and I said this to my peers around the state Friday in a webcast talking about this. We're committed to being the most transparent utility in Iowa when it comes to PFAS. And I'll talk with you just a little bit more about what we're doing on that. So there are 5 specific things that we are doing in response to PFAS. 4 of these were in effect prior to EPA coming out with the new health advisory levels. So these are actions that have been going on ever since. The first, we dedicated a page on our website specific to PFAS. And we gave it a friendly URL so that when we're in settings like this, it's easy for me to tell you what it is and it's easy for customers to remember. So it's cityofames.org/PFAS. And if you go there, you will see all of our testing results, not just for the 4 compounds that are covered by health advisories, but every chemical in this PFAS family that we've tested for. All of those results are there. We are, I believe, the only utility in the state that has undertaken as comprehensive of an assessment of our source water as what we have done. And we have looked at every single one of our wells. And that's the second thing that we're doing is that in-depth testing of all of those wells. They've all been tested at least once. Some of them have been tested a couple times. The finished drinking water we have tested 4 times since December. The third thing that we're doing is, and we signed this agreement back in March, I think, but a cooperative agreement with researchers at Iowa State University to do a source characterization for us. So in addition to just looking at what's in each of the wells, what Dr. Charbonnet is going to do is what he calls a PFAS fingerprint. And he says that each of the different applications of these chemicals leave a different fingerprint. There's different combinations of the chemicals present. And so they're going to attempt to try to tell us what was the original application that these compounds were used in. You know, was it an industrial lubricant? Was it a firefighting foam? Where did it come from? And then that will hopefully allow us, coupling it with the hydraulic models that we've got of our groundwater aquifer, to be able to trace back to where the potential geographic source of these chemicals might be. And that seemingly out-of-place picture up there of Daria, she is one of our student operators, and she is a graduate student working with Dr. Charbonnet, and she'll be the one doing all this analytical analysis for us. So out of a real challenge, Daria is going to come out of this as a leading expert in doing this PFAS fingerprinting technique. The fourth thing that we've done is to modify our source water. So these are the individual results of each of our wells. The blue is the concentration of PFOA, the yellow is PFOS, and you can see the very top of that chart is set at 70 parts per trillion. That's what the old health advisory level was. 9 of our 22 wells had no detectable levels at all. Of the other 13, 12 of them were below 10 parts, and you see well number 17 there really sticks out as an anomaly in the rest of our inventory. And so as soon as we saw these results, we stopped using well number 17. We have not abandoned it yet. We're going to kind of wait and see how the science plays out, but until we know more, we're going to stop using that well. And in a webcast that I listened to with EPA last Wednesday, they said that right now the guidance that they're giving utilities is just think about it like this. The lower the levels, the lower the risk. And so by taking that one well out of service, we've lowered our PFAS concentration by 75%. And then the last step that we're undertaking, and this is the one thing that we've done specifically in response to the EPA actions, is to ask Fox Strand Engineering here in Ames to help us with just a super high level conceptual evaluation of what type of PFAS treatment would make sense given the type of treatment that we've already got. We're certainly not planning to construct anything until the science shakes out and we know better what that might look like. But I thought it was important for us, for you, for our customers to understand what the cost might be of trying to get to those health advisory levels. So lastly, I just wanted to provide answers to probably the two most frequent questions that we've been getting. Is water with PFAS safe? And I've pulled some quotes from the EPA fact sheets. EPA says we don't really know yet. We know that these chemicals can cause harm, and the question is at what level does it require before they become toxic? So that science is ongoing, and but it's confusing, right? When you start talking about contaminants in drinking water, it makes everybody nervous because that's a very personal thing when you're drinking the water. And so I'm not a toxicologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I can't try to interpret all of this research that's been going on. But one of the things that I would offer is to try to provide a comparison to other more familiar contaminants in drinking water. And so the health advisories, and I'm going to use the PFOA compound, the one with the lowest concentration. If you compare that health advisory to what the regulatory limit is for mercury in drinking water, the health advisory for PFOA is 500,000 times lower than what the maximum contaminant level for mercury is. To me, again, is not a toxicologist, that feels out of whack. Especially if you think about the fact that for decades we've taken the most sensitive population, infants, and we've dressed them in stain-resistant clothing, and we've laid them on scotch-guarded carpet, and then to tell me that that's 500,000 times more toxic than mercury just doesn't intuitively feel right to me. So if you were to give me two glasses of water, one that's got mercury at the MCL, and the other that has PFAS at 500,000 times the health advisory, I'm taking the PFAS glass every time. Especially since if I eat a cheeseburger and then stick my finger in the glass of water, I've probably exceeded the health advisory just from what I picked up on my fingers. Our staff, even with the detection limit at 2 parts per trillion, they have to be double gloved when they're collecting samples. The labels that they use, they have to use certain brands of pens because some pens have PFAS in them. You can't use blue ice, the refrigerant for packing that material, because blue ice has PFAS in it. Out of risk that even just the regular ice that you're packing in might have PFAS, you have to double bag, but there's certain brands of bags that you have to use because the bags have PFAS in them. And it's so ubiquitous in the environment. I do struggle with the 500,000 times limit. And EPA does acknowledge that the limits that they've set, and I used the wrong word, they're not limits, they're advisories, but these advisories are lower than what their own science advisory board has recommended to them. And EPA says that when these health advisories are issued as final, they do expect them to go up. They say they do not expect them to go back up anywhere near what the old advisories levels were, though. So the other question that we've been asked the most is, should I switch to drinking bottled water? And I think there's this misconception that bottled water must be pure because it's bought in a grocery store. EPA in that same webcast last week categorically said we are not recommending that people switch to bottled water solely because their tap water exceeds these health advisory levels. And the screen capture that I include on this slide, this is from the International Bottled Water Association. And they say, in reference to PFAS on their website, there are no Food and Drug Administration standards for PFAS or even testing requirements in bottled water. And it's the USDA that controls bottled water, not the EPA. And the Bottled Water Association has a voluntary standard for their members, but at 5 and 10 parts, those do not, again, come anywhere close to the health advisory. And I'm not picking on these folks. I'm sure they got caught flat-footed just as much as the rest of the profession did a couple weeks ago when those new standards came out. Similarly, EPA made a categorical statement because one of the things in their advisory says that infants and breastfeeding moms are the most vulnerable population. But they came right out and said, we do not recommend that people stop breastfeeding because the water that the mother is drinking has PFAS in it. And they said that the advantages of breastfeeding far outweighs any potential risk from PFAS. And so kind of juxtaposing those comments from EPA, they're trying to soften a little bit, I think, what these numbers suggest. So really, that's all I've got for you tonight. I'm glad to answer any questions you might have. Some of the answers might be we don't know yet, but I'm glad to answer them anyway.